The silence inside Buckingham Palace was not uncertainty. It was the silence that follows a decision no one can reverse. King Charles had signed a direct palace order, restricting Meghan's use of royal identity, royal correspondence, palace connections, and ceremonial language in future public or commercial projects. The instruction was immediate: no negotiation, no private appeal. And when Prince William read the final page, even he appeared stunned by how far his father had chosen to go. Before we go deeper into what this really means for the royal family, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss a single update. Charles sat alone with the final memorandum open before him, knowing the signature at the bottom would change more than palace procedure. The Palace Communications and Royal Identity Order was a formal command controlling how royal symbols, private letters, ceremonial references, and suggestions of crown approval could be used outside official duties. It directed Meghan to remove those connections from future campaigns, speeches, commercial ventures, and media projects. More painfully, it ordered every royal office to end informal communication with her. From that moment, each request had to pass through one legal channel, closing the personal routes that had once allowed family pressure to reach palace aides. The king removed his glasses and read the final clause again. His senior household team had documented the risks in a private briefing, warning that unclear boundaries could make independent projects appear connected to the monarchy. That mattered because the crown's credibility depended on the public knowing when it had truly approved something. It also mattered because every private message could reopen disputes the palace believed had already been settled. Charles placed the pen beside the page and spoke without raising his voice. This must now end. William entered expecting another warning, perhaps a temporary restriction that could later be softened. He found something far more severe. The prince read the implementation date, then reached the passage covering private family correspondence. His expression changed immediately. He supported protecting the institution, but this was no longer simply a communications policy. His father had transformed a bitter family disagreement into an official barrier enforced by the crown itself. Meghan received the order through a secure written notice rather than a personal call. She read the opening paragraph twice, set the pages down, and demanded to know who had persuaded Charles to make the command so broad. Harry understood the deeper message before she finished speaking. The king had not only rejected a request, he had removed the informal access through which the Sussexes could still appeal to relatives and trusted staff. Camilla watched her husband after the signing and saw no victory in him. The queen consort understood that royal identity belonged to the monarchy, not to anyone who had once represented it. Yet she also knew the cost. Silencing one public conflict could deepen the private rupture with Harry. Then William looked directly at Charles and asked the question no one had prepared for. Why had the future king not been consulted? The monarch had closed Meghan's path into the palace, but in doing so, he had opened a far more dangerous division inside his own family. Behind the formal language stood 4 people carrying 4 different versions of betrayal. Charles believed he was defending the monarchy. Meghan believed she was being publicly diminished. Harry saw another door closing between himself and his father. William, trapped between duty and blood, feared the palace had chosen a weapon powerful enough to protect the crown, but sharp enough to cut through what remained of the family. The order was legal in form, yet painfully personal in effect. Charles carried 2 burdens at once, and neither allowed him peace. As sovereign, he believed royal symbols, private correspondence, and institutional authority had to remain under palace control. A sovereign is the reigning head of the monarchy, the person responsible for protecting the crown beyond personal loyalties. As a father, however, he knew Harry would not read the restriction as procedure. His younger son would see it as another rejection of the life he had built beyond Britain. That mattered because every official boundary now risked destroying what little private trust remained between them. Meghan felt something different. She saw the order as an attempt to reduce years of marriage, public service, criticism, and sacrifice to a chapter the palace alone could define. Her anger deepened because the institution still benefited from attention surrounding her name while denying her control over the meaning of her own royal past. She walked away from the document, returned moments later, and pointed directly at the clause banning implied palace endorsement. "They are attacking my credibility," she told Harry. "They want the history without allowing me to speak about what it cost." Harry did not answer immediately. His silence wounded her, because he had always defended her most fiercely when pressure came from London. Yet he understood the danger. A public counterattack could prove the palace's argument that informal arrangements had failed. He wanted to protect his wife, but he also feared losing the final private route to his father. The conflict was no longer about commercial language. It was about whether reconciliation could survive when discipline and affection were treated as opposing forces. William felt the consequences closing around him from another direction. Catherine found him standing beside an unopened folder in their sitting room, his hands resting against the edge of a table. He admitted that the order might be justified, but its severity could make peace impossible. The Princess of Wales, the wife of the future king, and a senior working member of the family, reminded him that previous compromises had repeatedly become public controversies. Then she warned him that humiliation could turn a temporary dispute into permanent hostility. William knew she was right on both counts, and that contradiction left him deeply unsettled. Charles later spoke privately with Camilla through a documented account prepared by a household secretary. He admitted that the prince's reaction had disturbed him more than Meghan's anger. The Queen consort understood why. William was not defending the Duchess. He was questioning whether frustration had finally pushed the king beyond careful judgment. She told her husband that authority could protect the institution, while still damaging the family carrying it. Each of them now stood to lose something irreversible. Charles risked Harry. Meghan risked ownership of her public identity. William risked inheriting a fractured family alongside the crown. Harry risked discovering that the palace door was still visible, but no longer open. Yet the signature was not where this crisis truly began. Weeks earlier, one private conversation had crossed a line Charles could no longer ignore. Every palace crisis has a moment that later becomes impossible to forget. In this case, it was not a televised interview or a public accusation. It was a private call made after a charity reception, when Meghan contacted a senior palace aide and demanded written confirmation that an upcoming project could reference her royal service. The request might have remained manageable. What happened next transformed it into the trigger Charles would later describe as the moment informal trust finally collapsed. Meghan made the call late in the evening, after a high-profile charitable reception in California. She contacted the deputy private secretary at Buckingham Palace and requested a formal letter confirming that her forthcoming media initiative continued values linked to her years as a working royal. A deputy private secretary is a senior palace official who helps manage correspondence, decisions, and communication around the monarch. The wording mattered because written acknowledgement from the household could give the project an appearance of continuing royal approval, even though she no longer represented the crown. The aide answered carefully. He explained that the palace could recognize her past service as historical fact, but it could not endorse an independent media or commercial venture. Meghan pressed further. She asked for permission to quote a line from an old private letter written while she still carried out official duties. When he refused, her voice hardened. She warned that continued resistance might force her to explain publicly how difficult it had become to obtain even basic recognition from the royal household. The call ended without agreement, but its consequences had already begun. The official prepared a documented account before midnight and sent it to the king's private secretary. The memorandum, a written record used to brief senior decision-makers, stated that private correspondence, palace approval, and the possibility of public pressure had become dangerously intertwined. Charles read it the following morning. He stopped at the sentence describing possible disclosure, circled it once, and asked whether other departments had received similar approaches. The answer changed everything. A second file contained requests involving ceremonial photographs, archived letters, charitable language, and guidance on placing royal titles beside future projects. The king saw a pattern. To him, the requests appeared to preserve the advantages of royal association, without accepting the restrictions placed on family members who no longer performed official duties. That mattered, because one vague approval could blur the line between personal history and present crown endorsement. It also mattered because every exception would weaken the palace's ability to enforce the same rule later. Meghan understood the history in the opposite way. She believed she had repeatedly asked for clear guidance and received changing answers. In a recorded conversation with Harry, she said written confirmation was necessary because the household could otherwise deny what had been discussed. He remembered Charles promising that sensitive family disputes would remain private. When he learned the account of the call had circulated among senior officials, he felt a personal disagreement had been converted into evidence against them. William discovered the trigger only after the order was already being drafted. His frustration deepened because he believed the difficult call should have led to direct confrontation, not a sweeping decree. Then the final proof arrived. Language resembling the requested royal acknowledgement appeared in an early promotional draft. Charles closed the file and made his decision. Ambiguity had become the danger. Another warning would no longer be enough. Armed with the hidden history of that call, William entered his father's private room, determined to challenge the decision, and neither man was prepared for what the other would say. There were no advisors between them, no secretaries to soften the language, and no cameras to force restraint. William closed the door and placed the order on his father's desk. Charles remained seated. For several seconds, neither spoke. Then the prince asked why a decision with consequences for the next reign had been made without him. The king's reply was calm, but it struck with the force of accusation. Because patience had become permission. William stayed standing inside the private Buckingham Palace office and pushed the signed directive closer. A directive is a formal instruction carrying the monarch's authority, and this one could shape how every future royal dispute was handled. The prince asked whether the order had truly been written to protect the crown, or whether anger toward Meghan had quietly turned protection into punishment. Charles rose from his chair and said the difference no longer mattered if private royal material kept drifting toward public ventures. The king controlled his voice, but not the bitterness beneath it. Every unanswered request, he argued, created another gray area. Every gray area invited another claim of approval. That mattered because the monarchy could not protect its name if outsiders believed personal access carried official backing. It also mattered because repeated exceptions would teach every non-working royal that persistence could defeat palace rules. William refused to yield. He warned that Harry would never read the order as legal protection. His brother would see a father choosing officials over his own son. The future king called the restriction permanent banishment, dressed in careful language, and that accusation finally cracked Charles's restraint. Charles stepped away from the desk and said Harry had repeatedly allowed private grievances to become public weapons. The monarch could not keep living under the threat that every refusal might appear in a future interview, recorded conversation, or published account. He pointed toward the directive and insisted that silence bought through appeasement was not peace. It was fear. William moved a chair aside but did not sit. He challenged the clause blocking informal family contact, saying relatives should not be treated like administrative channels. The prince feared that one harsh rule would make every private conversation feel dangerous. Charles answered that personal messages had already been used to bypass decisions, leaving family members exposed to pressure they had no power to resolve. The silence returned, heavier than before. The king then revealed through the documented legal briefing that Meghan was not the order's only target. The rule would become a precedent for any non-working royal who implied palace support without authorization. William understood the logic, but the timing still disturbed him. He asked whether his father had considered what Harry might release if he felt completely cornered. Charles looked directly at him. The crown, he said, could no longer let fear of retaliation govern its choices. William's final question cut through every institutional argument. And when he believes you have abandoned him completely, what then? The king turned away before answering. A father could leave a door open, he said, but a sovereign still had to guard the house. William picked up his copy of the order. Charles told him to leave it behind. The prince obeyed, knowing the decision was closed. Yet while father and son stood divided, the machinery behind the order was already moving through every corridor of the palace. Royal power rarely announces itself with shouting. It moves through sealed instructions, revised protocols, cancelled calls, and doors that no longer open. Within hours of Charles's signature, the palace began implementing the order across legal, communications, archives, and household offices. Yet behind that machinery stood a king who looked increasingly isolated. The decision carried his authority, but its weight settled on him personally as aides transformed one painful family boundary into a system no individual could quietly ignore. The private secretary convened a restricted meeting before noon. A private secretary is the senior official who coordinates the monarch's official work and turns royal decisions into practical instructions. Palace communicators, legal advisors, archival staff, and representatives from the separate households entered knowing the discussion could not leave the room. Each department received rules designed for future requests connected to Meghan, and each rule removed another place where personal judgment could once soften an official refusal. Communications officials were ordered not to confirm, deny, or quietly clarify claims involving her commercial projects without permission from the king's legal office. That mattered because one informal comment could be presented as palace approval. It also mattered because competing answers from different aides had helped create the confusion Charles now wanted destroyed. The Royal Archive received an equally firm command: no private letters, ceremonial photographs, invitations, drafts, or historical records could be released for promotional use without direct written approval. Household staff felt the change immediately. Personal familiarity no longer carried influence. Even aides who remembered Meghan warmly had to forward her requests instead of answering privately. The system succeeded because it left no uncertainty, but its cold precision made every former relationship feel like a liability. Charles approved the implementation schedule and asked everyone to leave. Camilla later found him alone with the original order still open before him. The Queen Consort told him that decisive leadership could carry grief without becoming weakness. He admitted through a documented account prepared by his senior aide that he had never imagined his reign would require formal barriers against someone who had once stood beside the family during public service. Camilla asked whether the clause limiting personal messages could be softened. Charles refused. One exception, he said, would destroy the clarity of the entire order. The king understood that compassion offered privately could quickly become leverage publicly. Yet refusing it made him appear less like a father and more like an institution. William discovered that the rules restricted him as well. Any conversation involving royal branding, private correspondence, or claims of palace support now had to be recorded. The prince saw this as a loss of family freedom. His father had not merely blocked Meghan, he had placed everyone inside a stricter structure because trust had collapsed. Meghan's representatives soon requested permission to mention her former royal patronages in biographical material. A royal patronage is an official connection through which a family member supports a charity or organization. The palace allowed historical fact, but rejected any wording suggesting current endorsement. Harry then called a familiar palace number. The aide who once answered him directly spoke courteously before transferring the matter to the new legal channel. That brief exchange wounded him more deeply than anger could have done. The palace had secured its boundaries, but outside those walls Meghan was preparing a response that would make the private fracture impossible to contain. The new reality arrived not through a public announcement, but through a series of refusals. A request received no personal reply. A familiar number redirected to a legal office. A planned statement was returned with disputed language marked for removal. Meghan understood immediately that the order was already active. She stood over the revised pages, anger rising with every crossed-out royal reference. Harry watched her expression harden, knowing that the next decision they made could determine whether the family fracture remained private or exploded before the world. Meghan's communications team received the formal notice before the day had fully settled. The document marked phrases such as royal-led service, official family initiatives, and references to private Crown correspondence for removal. Crown correspondence means letters or messages connected to the monarch's official role, not simply private family communication. The distinction mattered because those words could make an independent project appear supported by the palace. It also mattered because removing them allowed Charles to control the monarchy's present identity, even while she insisted on the right to describe her past. Meghan read every correction in silence, then pushed the pages away. Disbelief gave way to fury. She argued that palace officials were still shaping how she could speak about years of public service, sacrifice, and scrutiny. Harry urged her not to release an immediate statement. He feared his father expected an angry response that would prove stronger restrictions had been necessary. The warning struck like betrayal. Meghan accused him of asking her to absorb another humiliation quietly, while the palace presented its action as responsible governance. She said silence would allow the king to define the conflict before she had spoken a word. Harry finally admitted what truly frightened him. Not the order itself, but the possibility of losing every remaining path back to Charles. She answered without hesitation. Access without respect, she said, was not reconciliation. William received word in London that the Sussex team was preparing a public challenge. He told Catherine the crisis was following the exact path he had predicted. The Princess of Wales, the senior royal married to the future king, asked whether he intended to intervene. He said the new rules prevented him from negotiating privately without creating another unofficial channel. That restriction mattered because one secret conversation could undermine the system. Yet doing nothing could let a manageable dispute become a permanent family war. Charles then received a confidential briefing warning that Meghan might record a direct response. He closed the folder and ordered palace staff not to provoke her, brief against her, or publicly question her motives. The king wanted the order to stand alone. He refused to turn institutional control into personal revenge, even as advisors prepared defensive language in case the dispute erupted. Harry made one final attempt to reach his father directly. The call was acknowledged, but the monarch had been advised not to discuss the order while implementation continued. The Duke ended the exchange devastated, understanding that courtesy could wound more deeply than anger. Meghan postponed her response for 24 hours. The delay was not surrender. It was a strategic pause while she and Harry decided whether to fight together or follow different instincts. As anger pushed both sides toward permanent rupture, one unexpected private meeting created the first possibility that the order might produce clarity instead of destruction. The turning point did not come from Charles, Meghan, or a committee of palace officials. It began when William asked Harry for one private conversation, with no lawyers, no aides, and no prepared statements. The brothers spoke through a secure call, each alone, each aware that anything said could reopen years of anger. William did not defend the severity of the order. Harry did not excuse every public attack. For the first time, they spoke not as opposing royal camps, but as two sons confronting what remained. William opened the call carefully. He said he could not reverse the order, but he refused to let legal language become the only voice left between them. A secure call is a protected private conversation designed to prevent outside access or recording. Harry immediately suspected another attempt to force compliance. His tone changed only when the prince admitted that he had been stunned by their father's decision and had challenged Charles directly behind closed doors. Harry listened without interrupting. William explained that the king viewed the order as a boundary, not an attempt to erase Meghan from royal history. His brother answered that boundaries imposed without honest conversation felt exactly like rejection. The Duke said every formal restriction carried the same hidden message. The family would speak about him, judge him, and regulate him, but rarely speak to him. William pushed back. He said repeated public disclosures had made private trust almost impossible. Every conversation now carried the fear that one sentence might later appear in a documentary, interview, memoir, or recorded account. Harry replied that private appeals had often been ignored until he spoke publicly. Neither man accepted the other's version completely, yet something changed when both stopped trying to win. William then spoke about their children. He said he did not want George, Charlotte, Louis, Archie, or Lilibet to inherit a war they had never chosen. That mattered, because the damage was no longer contained between two brothers. It threatened to shape how the next generation understood family, duty, and belonging. It also mattered because children separated by distance could grow up knowing one another only through headlines and old photographs. Harry fell silent before admitting his deepest fear. He worried that his children would know the royal family as an institution rather than as people who loved them. The confession stripped away the anger, leaving only exhaustion. William proposed a narrow solution. Meghan would respect the institutional restrictions, while Charles would allow a separate private family channel that could never be used for projects, negotiations, or public claims. Harry agreed to present the distinction to his wife, but insisted the palace must stop treating every mention of her royal years as exploitation. Meghan listened as her husband described the recorded conversation. She remained angry, yet she understood that a protected personal channel would prevent the order from becoming complete exile. Charles hesitated when the proposal reached him. The king finally agreed on one condition: family contact must remain private, with no excerpts or summaries entering public material. The order stayed intact, but the family bond was not formally severed. The private compromise steadied them, yet the world knew only that Charles had issued an extraordinary command, and public judgment was about to arrive with brutal force. By sunrise, the palace order was no longer a private instrument of royal control. It had become a national argument about authority, family, race, loyalty, and the price of leaving royal life. Newsrooms abandoned their planned broadcasts. Commentators divided into opposing camps. Outside Buckingham Palace, tourists stopped beneath the gates to read breaking alerts on their phones. One decision, signed in silence, had become a public test of whether the monarchy was defending its dignity or exposing its deepest wound. The London Herald captured the shock with a full-width front page declaring, "The King draws the line," above contrasting photographs of Charles and Meghan. A national breakfast broadcaster called the decision the most severe royal communications restriction imposed on a close family member in the modern era. A communications restriction is a rule limiting how royal names, symbols, letters, or official links may be used. That distinction mattered because the order did not prevent Meghan from speaking. It prevented her independent work from appearing to carry current palace support. Crowds gathered near the Victoria Memorial outside Buckingham Palace. Some praised the king for defending the institution. Others held handwritten signs accusing the monarchy of silencing a woman it had failed to protect. One woman told a live reporter that loyalty could not be demanded while criticism was rejected. Moments later, a retired serviceman answered that royal status could not be used selectively after official duty had ended. Their opposing words captured the national divide more clearly than any palace statement. Meghan's supporters argued that her years inside royal life belonged to her personal history. They insisted no decree could erase what she had experienced. Charles's defenders answered that private memory and present endorsement were not the same thing. The king, they said, was protecting the public from confusing past service with current authority. William unexpectedly became part of the debate when a documented palace account revealed that he had been surprised by the order. Commentators questioned whether the prince had opposed his father or simply feared the consequences. He watched the discussion grow, knowing that any public clarification could reopen the division he had just helped contain. The palace issued one restrained statement, confirming that updated guidelines now governed royal correspondence, institutional references, and official symbols used by non-working family members. Meghan then released a carefully written response. She acknowledged the restrictions, but declared that no palace command could erase her lived experience. Her decision not to attack Charles by name revealed how deeply the private compromise had shaped her tone. Harry remained apart from her statement. Through a separate written message, he expressed hope that clearer boundaries would allow private family relationships to remain protected. His restraint surprised those expecting another public confrontation. Charles watched the coverage without speaking. Camilla switched off the television when a panel began questioning his motives. The Queen Consort waited until the room was quiet. The king then said public approval had never been the objective. Clarity was. By evening, the anger began to soften. Britain remained divided, but the feared explosion never came. When the headlines faded and the crowds dispersed, only one question remained. Had Charles protected the monarchy, or merely taught his family how to live farther apart? The palace order did not produce a winner. Charles preserved the authority of the crown, but he was forced to confront the human cost of ruling through boundaries. Meghan retained her voice, yet lost the freedom to surround future work with the language of present royal connection. Harry kept a private path to his father, though it now came with conditions. William, stunned at first, became the person who prevented institutional discipline from turning into complete personal exile. That was the true verdict. The order remained fully in force. The Palace Communications and Royal Identity Order, a formal command controlling the use of royal symbols, private correspondence, archived material, and suggestions of present crown approval, could not be ignored or quietly softened. Meghan could still speak about her life, but she could not use royal insignia, restricted letters, ceremonial records, or language implying active palace support without written permission. That mattered because palace staff finally knew how to respond. It also mattered because commercial partners could no longer claim uncertainty about where personal history ended and official endorsement began. Meghan adapted without surrendering her sense of self. She separated her public identity from active palace association and stopped framing independent ventures through ceremonial language tied to the current monarchy. In a recorded private conversation with Harry, she said she would never pretend the decision had been fair. Yet she also refused to let one order define every chapter that followed. Her acceptance was controlled, not defeated. She had lost access to royal authority, but not the right to tell her own story. Harry accepted the private family channel negotiated by William. The arrangement allowed personal contact while blocking discussions about projects, legal disputes, publicity, or institutional claims. His first call with Charles was cautious and brief. Neither man apologized for everything. Neither raised his voice. But neither ended the conversation in anger, and that small difference carried enormous weight. Charles remained seated after the call with the telephone still in his hand. The king felt no triumph. He had protected the crown's boundaries, yet the relief on his face revealed what had truly frightened him, that enforcing those limits might cost him his son forever. The monarch had succeeded institutionally, but success came wrapped in grief. William emerged from the crisis changed. He understood that future kingship would demand clear rules and hard decisions. Yet Catherine reminded him that authority without a human bridge could turn conflict into permanent estrangement. The Princess of Wales told him his intervention had not weakened the order. It had given the family a way to survive it. Her words allowed the prince to see that compassion and discipline did not have to destroy one another. Camilla recognized the same truth. The Queen Consort saw that her husband's bold action had strengthened the institution, while exposing its emotional fragility. Royal power looked absolute from the outside, but those carrying it surrendered freedoms ordinary families took for granted. The public argument gradually faded. No dramatic reunion followed, but neither did the feared explosion. Charles had silenced the use of royal authority around Meghan's independent ambitions, not Meghan herself. The distinction preserved the monarchy's control and her voice. The order closed one of the crown's most painful battles, not with revenge, but with a final boundary. The monarchy would protect its name, while the family learned that love could survive only when access, influence, and control were no longer confused with one another. Thanks for watching. Please don't forget to like and subscribe, and we will see you in next one.